The entire restaurant held its breath, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Don Salvatore had just humiliated the shy waitress, Ella, for a culinary mistake he assumed was her fault. He saw a girl who was easy to break, a nobody he could crush under his ebony cane. He was wrong. Instead of trembling, Ella looked the Don directly in the eye and corrected him. She didn't use English. She spoke in a rare, ancient Sicilian dialect, a tongue that had not echoed through the underworld for half a century. The room went ice cold. The Don's hand froze halfway to his weapon as he realized this wasn't just a waitress. She was a ghost from a past he had tried to bury with fire, and she was the only one in the room who could see the red dot of a sniper dancing across his chest. The kitchen of the restaurant smelled of expensive herbs, seared meats, and pure, unadulterated panic. Move, move, move. Gerard, the floor manager, was a man on the edge of a breakdown, his face pale as he barked orders at the line cooks. If the silverware wasn't polished to a mirror finish, he promised they would never work in the city again. He wiped sweat from his brow, his eyes darting to the clock. It was nearly time. Ella adjusted her apron, her movements mechanical and small. At her age, she had perfected the art of being invisible. She kept her hair tight and her head down, using her quiet demeanor as a shield to hide her hazel eyes, eyes that had seen her family home torched to the ground. Ella. Gerard snapped his fingers in her face, causing her to flinch. "You are on water duty. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look them in the eye. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," she whispered. "But who is coming?" Gerard looked at her with pure disbelief. "The Moretti family, Ella. Don Salvatore and his son Hong. De capo di capi." They had rented the entire VIP section, and the air already felt heavy with their approaching predatory grace. Ella felt a cold shiver trace its way down her spine. The Morettis. Even in the safety of her new life, she knew the name of the man who had been sent to end her bloodline. The dining room of L'Orloio was a cathedral of glass and gold, but as Don Salvatore and Hong took their seats, it felt more like a courtroom. The kitchen staff stood in a rigid, trembling line, their eyes fixed on the floor as if looking up would invite an execution. Don Salvatore sat at the head of the table, his silver-topped lion cane leaning against the white linen like a dormant weapon. Beside him, Hong, Lorenzo, sat with a predatory stillness, his jet-black hair slicked back and his jawline looking as though it had been carved from the very marble of the restaurant floor. Ella stepped forward, her hands steady despite the frantic thrumming of her heart. She moved with the practiced invisibility of shadow, reaching out to set the appetizer, a delicate sea-based crudo finished with a vibrant citrus reduction. The Don didn't even take a bite. He stared at the plate, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of the sauce. With a flick of his wrist that sent a chill through the room, he shoved the plate toward the edge of the table. "Take this away," he rasped, his voice like gravel, grinding on stone. "It insults me. Tell the chef he is a fraud. He has used common tangerines to mimic the soul of Sicily. I will not have this swill in my sight." Gerard, the manager, looked ready to faint, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. But Ella didn't move to take the plate. Instead, she stood her ground, her hazel eyes hidden behind the frames of her unnecessary glasses, flickering with a sudden, dangerous light. The shy waitress who had spent years perfecting the art of being nobody suddenly found her voice. "It isn't tangerine, Don Salvatore," she said, her voice clear and resonant in the vacuum of the room. The silence that followed was absolute. Hong looked up, his dark eyes narrowing as he focused on the black woman standing defiantly before his father. Ella didn't stop. She spoke again, but the language that left her lips wasn't English. It wasn't even the standard Italian the tourists used. It was a thick, rhythmic, and guttural Sicilian dialect, a specific arbor-inflected tongue used only in the remote volcanic shadow of Mount Etna. It was the language of the old world, the language of the Vitali bloodline. "Idu Ederaku, Don Salvatore," she murmured, her accent flawless and ancient. Nascita d'intra a terra vuricata di Catania. Non è finto. È lo sangue di la Sicilia. The Don't hand, which had been reaching for his wine glass, froze mid-air. Every guest at the surrounding tables seemed to turn to stone. This was not the speech of a waitress in Manhattan. This was a greeting from a ghost. She had identified the Tarraco orange, the queen of oranges, grown only in volcanic soil, and she had done it using a dialect that had been systematically wiped out of the underworld decades ago. Hong leaned forward, his gaze intensifying as he scanned Ella's face, searching for a familiarity he couldn't yet place. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the weight of a past that was no longer buried. "Where did a girl like you learn to speak like that?" the Don whispered, his terror masked by a sudden, sharp curiosity. Ella lowered her head, the mask of the shy waitress slipping back into place, but the damage was done. She had defended the kitchen's honor, but in doing so, she had signaled to the predators that a Vitali was still breathing. The silence following Ella's Sicilian greeting was thick, vibrating with the unspoken questions of the man who ruled the city's shadows. Don Salvatore stared at her, his hooded eyes searching her face for a map of a world he thought he had destroyed. Hong remained motionless, his dead, shark-like eyes tracking the way Ella's hands trembled, not with the fear of a waitress, but with the kinetic energy of someone coiled to spring. "You have a dangerous tongue for someone so small," Hong murmured, his low and warning voice cutting through the tension. Ella didn't answer. The adrenaline was already beginning to surge, a familiar, cold electricity she hadn't felt since she was a child in the Vitali estate. Her gaze, trained by a father who knew that death often arrived from a distance, flickered toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the rain-slick streets of Manhattan. The light in the restaurant was dim, designed for intimacy and secrets, but a sudden, microscopic glint caught the corner of her eye. It was a reflection off the glass, a shimmer that didn't belong to the chandeliers. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked at Don Salvatore's charcoal three-piece suit. There, centered over his heart, was a tiny, pulsing spark of crimson. A red dot. In that heartbeat, the world slowed to a crawl. She saw the Don tapping his silver lion's head cane, oblivious to the light dancing on his chest. She saw Hong beginning to reach for the Glock tucked beneath his tailored jacket. She saw the prowling bodyguards scanning the room, their eyes missing the one threat that mattered because it was coming from the sky. "Get down!" Ella's voice shattered the stillness, no longer shy or whispered. She didn't wait for them to react. With a specialized speed that betrayed years of hidden training, she launched herself across the narrow gap between the service aisle and the VIP table. Her shoulder collided with the Don's chest just as the first suppressed crack of high-velocity glass echoed through the dining room. The force of her tackle sent the elderly man spiraling out of his chair. They hit the marble floor together, the Don't ebony cane skittering away with a hollow clatter. A split second later, the crystal wine glass she had just polished disintegrated, showering them in a rain of sharp, sparkling shards. The restaurant erupted into chaos. The line cook's sizzling pans were forgotten as screams filled the air. Hong was on his feet instantly, his weapon drawn with predatory grace as he shielded his father's fallen form. He looked down at the floor, expecting to see a clumsy waitress, but he found Ella pinned under the Don, her arms sliced by a shard of glass. Blood trickled down her white sleeve, staining the fabric of vivid, messy red. She was gasping for air, her adrenaline fading into a cold, paralyzing terror. She had saved the man she was supposed to hate, the man whose family had taken everything from her. Don Salvatore rasped, pointing a shaking finger at her as Hong hauled her to her feet. The Don's face was no longer a map of hard-won battles. It was a mask of pure shock. "Ow!" the Don demanded, his voice cracking. "How did you know?" Hong's grip on her uninjured arm was bruisingly tight. He wasn't looking at the window or the hidden assassin anymore. He was looking at Ella, horror dawning on his face as the image of a little girl with hazel eyes flashed through his mind. a girl he was certain had died in the smoke and fire of the Vitali massacre. "No waitress reacts that fast," Hong whispered, his voice hollow with the weight of a ghost suddenly made flesh. The air in the dining room remained thick with the smell of ozone and gunpowder, the silence after the shot even more deafening than the blast itself. Hong stood over the wreckage of the VIP table, his silhouette a dark, jagged line against the chaos of the restaurant. His weapon was still out, but his focus had shifted entirely from the shattered window to the woman trembling at his feet. He grabbed Ella's uninjured arm and hauled her to her feet with a strength that felt like iron. Around them, the prowling bodyguards had formed a human wall, but Hong ignored them. He pulled Ella into the flickering light of a nearby wall sconce, his dead, shark-like eyes scanning her face with a terrifying intensity. "No waitress reacts that fast," Hong murmured, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that made the fine hairs on Ella's neck stand up. "No waitress recognizes a sniper glint before the professionals do." Ella couldn't breathe, the adrenaline that had fueled her leap now fading, replaced by a paralyzing terror. She tried to pull away, but Hong's grip only tightened. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked struck and suspicious, as if he were staring at a riddle he was starting to solve. He looked down at her arm, where a shard of glass had cut her deeply. Blood was trickling down her white sleeve, a vivid, spreading stain that stood out against the stark uniform. The sight of the blood seemed to trigger something in him. Not pity, but a memory. "You!" Don Salvatore rasped from his chair, his shaking finger pointing at the crimson on her sleeve. "How did you know? Who taught you to move like that?" Ella stammered, her voice thin and reedy. I saw the reflection." "Liar," Hong hissed, stepping over a pile of broken glass to pull her even closer until she could smell the expensive tobacco and cold steel on him. He reached out with his free hand, his thumb catching a smudge of soot on her cheek, a remnant of the kitchen's chaos, or perhaps a shadow of an older fire. He leaned in, his gaze boring into her hazel eyes. "I've seen those eyes before," he whispered, his voice hollow with a sudden, dawning horror. "I've seen them looking up at me through smoke and screams." Ella felt her knees grow weak. She was standing in the center of his power, her blood staining the floor of the empire that had sought to extinguish her name. She had saved the man she was supposed to hate, and in doing so, she had revealed herself completely. The mask of the shy waitress was gone, shattered as surely as the crystal on the floor. Hong's hand trembled slightly as he traced the line of her jaw. The interrogation was no longer about the assassin in the street. It was about the ghost standing in front of him. "Tell me your name," he commanded, though the way he said it suggested he already knew the answer. "Tell me who you really are before I let my father finish the job I started 10 years ago." Hong's grip tightened, his fingers digging into the fabric of Ella's blood-stained sleeve as he dragged her further into the shadows of the VIP mezzanine, away from the prying eyes of the panicked staff. The dead, shark-like eyes that usually characterized the Moretti enforcer were gone, replaced by a gaze that was frantic, searching, and haunted. He forced her to look at him, his breathing coming in jagged bursts that mirrored the volatile pacing of the night's violence. "I know that look," Hong whispered, his voice hollow and stripped of its usual predatory authority. He wasn't seeing the waitress in the stained uniform anymore. He was looking through a portal of time to a night 10 years ago, a night thick with smoke and fire. He remembered the heat of the Vitali estate as it crumbled, the smell of burning cedar and the weight of the torch in his hand. It had been his initiation, his 18th birthday, a night designed to prove himself to his father by extinguishing a rival bloodline. He remembered giving the order to torch the main house, believing he had been thorough. But as the roof had groaned and the windows shattered, he had glimpsed a pair of hazel eyes through a gap in the floorboards, eyes wide with a terror so profound it had burned itself into his subconscious. Roberto Vitali had a daughter, Hong said, the name hitting the air like a physical blow of guilt. A little girl with hazel eyes. We searched the ruins for days. We never found the body. Ella's defiance flickered, her blazing eyes momentarily clouding with the memory of that initiation night. The mask of the shy waitress she had spent a decade building was now nothing more than ash. She didn't flinch as he loomed over her. Instead, she stood with a fierce, burning admiration for the truth that was finally being bared. "I was that girl," she whispered, her voice no longer reedy but grounded in the honor of her lineage. "I crawled out when the smoke cleared. I took a bus to the city, cut my hair, and changed my name because I just wanted to disappear." The revelation froze the air between them. Hong looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not a threat or a target, but a survivor of his own making. The girl he'd been sent to kill had just saved his father's life, and the realization was a horror dawning on his face. He had created this ghost, and now, standing amidst the broken glass of his father's dinner, he was forced to confront the living embodiment of his greatest sin. Hong's grip on her arm didn't loosen, but the pressure changed from a threat to a tether. As if he were afraid she might evaporate back into the shadows of the past. Ella looked at the blood staining her white sleeve, the same color as the embers that had haunted her dreams for a decade. The dead, shark-like eyes of the man before her were now wide with a hollow, dawning horror. "I didn't just survive," Ella whispered, her voice steadying as she finally let the ghost of the girl he had tried to kill speak. "I crawled out when the smoke cleared, while the beams of the main house were still groaning and the air was thick with the smell of my own life turning to ash." She looked past Hong, seeing not the opulent restaurant, but the black skeleton of the Vitali estate. "I was 18, the same age as you were when you led the charge to prove your worth to a father who demands blood for breakfast." She described the grueling journey that followed the massacre. She hadn't stayed to weep over the ruins or seek out the remnants of her father's soldiers. Instead, she had taken a bus to the city with nothing but the soot on her skin and the ringing in her ears. "I cut my hair until I didn't recognize the face in the mirror," she said, her hazel eyes blazing with the memory of her transformation. "I changed my name. I took the most invisible jobs I could find. I didn't want revenge, Hong. I didn't want to be a piece on your family's chessboard. I just wanted to live." Hong listened, his face pale, looking at her not as a target, but as a survivor of his own making. The guilt hit him like a physical blow, a weight far heavier than the tailored Tom Ford suit he wore like armor. He had spent 10 years believing he had successfully extinguished the Vitali bloodline, only to find the air hiding in the heart of his own territory, serving him water and wine. "I became Ella," she continued, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration. "I learned to move softly, to speak only when spoken to, and to keep my head down so no one would see the fire I was still carrying." She looked at the Don, who remained frozen in his chair, and then back to Hong, the man who had destroyed her world. "I worked in this kitchen for 2 years, watching you and your father come and go, knowing exactly who you were every time I polished a glass. I became a shadow because the sun was too dangerous." The room remained silent, the only sound the crackling of the nearby fire and the heavy, jagged breathing of a man who realized his initiation had been a failure. Ella stood tall, her blazing eyes refusing to blink, a queen of the ashes confronting the king of the ruins. Hong's expression was a storm of conflicting shadows, his fingers still tracing the line where the shy waitress ended and the Vitali air began. He looked at the blood on her sleeve, then at the shattered glass, his mind struggling to reconcile the girl he had been ordered to execute with the woman who had just shielded his father from a bullet. "What?" Hong's voice was a jagged whisper, barely audible over the distant sirens of the approaching police. "You hate us. You have every reason to want my father dead. You could have stood still. You could have let the sniper do what I failed to do 10 years ago. Why save him?" Ella stood her ground, her hazel eyes blazing with a clarity that seemed to illuminate the dark corners of the mezzanine. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a woman who carried an entire legacy in her marrow. "When I saw that red on his chest," Ella said, her voice resonant and unafraid, "I didn't see the monster of New York. I didn't see the man who signed my family's death warrant or the man who took my home. I just saw an old man about to be murdered in cold blood. She took a step closer to Hong, forcing him to meet her gaze. My father, Roberto Vitali, was many things, but he was never a coward. He taught me that power without principle is just butchery. He taught me that there is no honor in a cowardly kill. The words hit Hong with the force of a physical blow. He had been raised in a world where honor was often just a synonym for vengeance, where loyalty was bought with fear and maintained through blood. But Ella was speaking of a different kind of strength, a moral compass that remained true even in the heart of a hurricane. "I'm not you, Hong," she continued, her voice dropping to a low, steady vibration that commanded the air between them. "I don't kill for power, and I don't let people die just because it would make my life easier. I saved him because it was the right thing to do. Even if I hate you for what you took from me, I will not become you." The room was silent, save for the rhythmic crackle of the fire in the dining room below. Hong stared at her, mesmerized. She was standing in the center of his power, admitting she was the heir to his family's greatest enemy, yet she held her head higher than any queen. The hatred he was supposed to feel, the ingrained, ironclad duty to extinguish the Vitali bloodline, was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was a fierce, burning admiration that frightened him more than any rival's gun. He looked at the girl who had crawled out when the smoke cleared, realizing that while he had spent a decade building an empire of fear, she had built a fortress of character. He realized, with a sinking heart, that the girl he had tried to destroy had actually grown into the only person in the world who could truly challenge him. The sirens outside were a muffled wail against the sound of Hong's own pulse thundering in his ears. He looked at Ella, no, at Sienna Vitali, and felt as though the floor of Lorloyo had turned into the shifting ash of her childhood home. The physical blow of his guilt wasn't a sharp pain. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that settled deep in his chest, making every breath feel like he was inhaling the very smoke he had unleashed 10 years ago. He let go of her arm, but his hand remained suspended in the air between them, trembling with a rare, jagged vulnerability. For a decade, Hong had carried the torch of the Moretti legacy, believing his initiation had been a clean, necessary erasure of an enemy. He had walked away from the Vitali estate feeling like a man, never realizing he was leaving behind a ghost that would grow in the dark, nourished by the very invisibility he had forced upon her. "I did this," he whispered, the words tasting like copper. He looked at her severe bun, the glasses she didn't need, and the way she stood, shoulders square, jaw set in a line of Vitali honor, and realized that her entire existence was a monument to his cruelty. Every day she had spent hiding, every smudge she had rubbed off a glass in silence, was a sentence he had written for her. He had created this ghost. He had taken a vibrant air and turned her into a shadow that served him water while bleeding from a wound he had indirectly caused. The irony was a blade twisting in his gut. He had spent his life trying to be the predatory king his father demanded, but looking at Ella, he felt like a hollow shell. She had more power in her blood-stained white sleeve than he had in his entire, bespoke suited entourage. Hong's gaze dropped to the floor, where the broken glass sparkled like the diamonds her family once owned. He saw his own reflection in the shards, fragmented, distorted, and ugly. He had thought he was protecting his family's future that night, but he had only succeeded in haunting his own soul. The fierce, burning admiration he felt for her wasn't just about her bravery. It was a desperate, aching wish that he could have been more like her, someone who could choose honor over a cowardly kill. The weight of the torch he had carried for the Morettis suddenly felt too hot to hold. He looked back at her hazel eyes, searching for the little girl he had seen through the floorboards. She was still there, but she had become something formidable, a survivor who had crawled out when the smoke cleared to prove that the Morettis could burn a house, but they could never truly kill a Vitali. The sirens outside grew louder, their blue and red lights rhythmically strobing against the velvet curtains like a heartbeat under pressure. Inside the mezzanine, The air was static, thick with the scent of iron and the weight of a decade's worth of secrets. Hong stepped closer to Ella, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor until it swallowed her small frame. The predatory grace that usually defined him had sharpened into something more desperate, a frantic energy that made his jaw tighten until the bone threatened to snap. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he whispered, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. He reached out, his hand hovering near her blood-stained sleeve before pulling back, as if the heat of her presence burned him. "By speaking that dialect, by showing that speed, by telling me who you are, you haven't just saved a life. You have signed your own death warrant." Ella didn't flinch. She stood amidst the broken glass and the ruins of the dinner, her hazel eyes fixed on his with a fierce, burning admiration for the truth. She was no longer the shy waitress. She was the ghost that had finally stepped out of the smoke. "I know the rules of your world, Hong," she replied, her voice steady enough to cut through the tension. "I've known them since the night you stood on my lawn and watched my world burn." Hong's eyes darkened, a flash of genuine agony crossing his face. He looked toward the door where his father, Don Salvatore, was being shielded by a wall of muscle. The Don was a man of the old code, a man for whom a surviving Vitali was not a person, but a loose thread that had to be pulled until the entire cloth unraveled. "If my father finds out a Vitali is in this house, if he realizes that the girl from that night is standing right here, he will finish the job," Hong hissed, his pulse visible in the cord of his neck. "He doesn't believe in honor or cowardly kills. He believes in extinction. He will not care that you saved him. He will only care that you exist." The stakes of their man versus past conflict reached a fever pitch. The silence of the restaurant felt like a gallows. Hong was the underboss, the enforcer who had spent his life proving he could be as cold as the steel he carried. His duty was clear. He was supposed to draw his weapon and end the threat to his family's reign right here, among the white truffles and spilled wine. "I am the heir to your family's greatest enemy," Ellis said, stepping even closer, her chest nearly touching his bespoke jacket. "So tell me, Hong, are you going to tell him? Are you going to be the one to finish what you started 10 years ago?" The question hung in the air, a lethal blade suspended by a single thread. Hong looked down at her, his dead, shark-like eyes finally breaking, revealing a man plagued by the physical blow of a guilt he could no longer outrun. The sirens reached the front doors, the flashing lights painting the room in the colors of an emergency, mirroring the crisis of a man forced to choose between the blood of his father and the life of the woman who had survived him. The blue and red lights of the police cruisers strobed against the high ceilings of the restaurant, painting the scene in the colors of an emergency. Hong stood in the center of the wreckage, his silhouette a dark, jagged line against the chaos. He looked down at Ella, his breathing shallow and uneven, the ironclad mask of the Moretti underboss finally beginning to crack under the weight of her presence. The tension in the room was a living thing, a coiled spring ready to snap. Ella didn't back away. Even as the prowling bodyguards moved to secure the perimeter and the Dawn was ushered toward a secure exit, she remained rooted to the spot, her hazel eyes locked on Hong's with a fierce, burning defiance. She had crawled out when the smoke cleared 10 years ago, and she was done running. Hong slowly reached out. His hand, which had pulled a trigger countless times without a tremor, shook slightly as he closed the distance between them. He didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a touch that was unexpectedly tender, yet heavy with the physical blow of his internal conflict. The heat of her skin against his palm felt like a brand, a reminder that she was made of flesh and blood, not the ash of his memories. "I should," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that vibrated in the small space between them. "It is my duty as underboss to ensure no Vitali ever breathes the same air as a Moretti again. My father expects your head on a platter for the sins of your bloodline." He leaned in closer until his forehead nearly brushed hers. The dead, shark-like eyes were gone, replaced by a new, dark attraction that burned hotter than the fire he had used to destroy her home. It was a deadly choice that sat on the edge of his tongue. He had spent his life being the predatory enforcer his father demanded. But looking at the woman who had saved his family despite her hatred, he realized he could no longer be that man. "But I look at you," he whispered, his thumb pressing harder against her skin, "and all I see is the ghost I've been chasing for a decade. I didn't just create you, Ella. I've been haunted by you." The transformation was complete. The underboss's mercy wasn't an act of kindness. It was a surrender. He wasn't just choosing to spare her. He was choosing to protect the only person who made him feel like more than a monster. He knew that by keeping her secret, he was betraying his father, his crown, and his legacy. He was placing a target on his own back to keep her safe. "Go," he commanded, his voice breaking with the weight of the sacrifice. "Get out of here before the police start taking statements. If you stay, I have to kill you. If you run, I have to hunt you." He leaned down, his lips ghosting against her ear. "And God help me. I think I'd rather spend my life hunting you than a single second living in a world where you're finally gone." He pulled back, his hand dropping to his side as he reclaimed his predatory grace. He turned his back on her, signaling his bodyguards to move, leaving Ella standing in the ruins of Lorloyo. As she disappeared into the night, a shadow, once more, Hong felt the cold of the restaurant settle into his bones, knowing that the man versus past war had ended and a much more dangerous game had just begun.